Welcome to Scouting for Growth. Let me start with a provocation. Most boards today believe that they are managing AI risk. They have the frameworks, committees, policies. Some even have a human in the loop, which sounds reassuring. But here is the reality no one is saying out loud. You cannot govern what you cannot truly understand. And you certainly cannot control what is starting to act on your behalf. Because we are no longer deploying tools, we are deploying decision makers. And yet, in too many organizations, trust is still treated as a compliance exercise, instead of the one thing that determines whether AI scales safely or fails spectacularly. So today I want to explore a sharper question. What does it actually take to build organizations where trust is engineered into every decision before autonomy outpaces accountability? To unpack this, I'm joined by Steven Abel from Oliver Wyman and Franklin Manchester from SAS. This is a conversation about trust by design, not as a slogan, but as a leadership mandate. Because in the age of agentic AI, trust isn't what you say, it is what your system does. Hello, and welcome to today's conversation on trust is the operating system of the agentic enterprise. I'm today with Franklin Manchester and Steven Abel, and we are going to dive into a concept which is so important to me right now. Not only frontier enterprise, but also trust by design. We know that most enterprises are still treating AI trust as a control problem. But in the agentic enterprise, trust becomes an architectural problem. So today, I want to explore one question with Steve and Franklin. What does it actually take to operationalize trust by design before autonomy outpaces governance? So welcome, Steve. I know you come from Oliver Wyman and Franklin from SAS. So let's start with some intro because I do not assume that everybody knows you. So I will start with you, Franklin, and then go to Steve, and then I will throw my first question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sabine, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. Franklin Manchester, I'm the Global Insurance Strategic Advisor here at SAS Institute. Been with the organization about 4 years, and prior to joining SAS, spent about 20 years at 2 different insurance carriers, mostly in underwriting and analytical type roles. You may see me online as a hopeless insurance nerd and enthusiast, and just really excited to be here to be a part of this conversation. Thanks, Sabine.
Welcome. Steve.
Thanks, Sabine. Steven Abel. I'm a global technology partner at Oliver Wyman, and I'm also the deputy global head of AI and transformation. I am also a nerd and technology enthusiast, so I think we'll have a good conversation today.
So let's start with the industry, right? It's over-indexing on models and under-investing on trust. And just 2 days ago, you won't believe, I saw a Fortune 500 piece of article saying that 93% of organizations are investing in AI and only 7% on people. So Steve, let's start with you. What is the industry still getting fundamentally wrong when it assumes that more models, more data, and more tools will somehow create more trust?
My belief is the indexing on the LLM features of AI is interesting but wrong thinking when it comes to the trust agenda. The architecture of these models themselves don't lend themselves to a high trust environment. And it's not to say that AI and LLMs aren't unbelievably powerful tools. And it's not to say that in conjunction with other tools and techniques, we can't build high trust environments. It's just been an under-invested, under-focused on area in the AI landscape. And we're still having conversations about human in the loop, which drives me crazy because it's not an effective way to manage trust at scale.
So Franklin, where do you see companies confusing AI activity with actual AI readiness? And maybe you want to comment on the human in the loop, on the loop, because these are conversations we are having all the time as well in the industry.
Yeah, completely agree. The data we have from the SAS Trust Imperative Report shows that about 70% of insurers are using some form of AI, more traditional AI like machine learning, but only 7% are what we might call transformative. They're really starting to accelerate their adoption, utilization of artificial intelligence. And many of them are either underutilizing trustworthy systems or putting more reliance on systems that are not trustworthy. So that type of disconnect, that mismatch, is confusing that AI readiness because it's not actually enterprise ready. One of the fun facts from that same report is we trust generative AI 200% more than machine learning, which is bonkers to me because machine learning has been around for like 30 years. But it really speaks to this very human reaction that we trust things that give us a sentimental answer. So I think that really underscores the issues that we're dealing with.
Yeah. And I remember the piece of research SAS put out with The Economist last year, right? 200% of us trust AI system more than we trust normal machine learning systems. And it's interesting because that requires for us to rethink what is our role when we actually use generative AI system, right? Okay, we may be orchestrators, but we need also to be investigators. We need to actually be managing those systems because of the hallucination, right? It's still there. And we need to make sure we implement the right guardrail. But it is clear that adoption is moving fast. And we need to make sure within regulated industry that we apply trust in everything we do. Otherwise, we are going to churn those customers. So why the old control logic breaks under autonomy? Steve, you've said, yes, human in the loop, and you just said this to us a few moments ago. Well, that is a term we use, but probably we don't treat the terms in the right way, or we understand the terms the way, an enterprise should be operating. Why is that dangerous for you or incomplete, partly in high-stake regulated industry like the one we operate in, like risk management field, finance, insurance, and so on and so forth?
I have two lines of inquiry or answers on that. The first is, what is the infrastructure that sits around the LLMs? LLMs are going to hallucinate. LLMs are going to give you answers that are not right. That's fine. That's a feature. There are kernel infrastructure using hashing technology, and I won't get into it, that we can borrow from other sectors. They can manage transparency and auditability. In AI research, there are 3 states that you can put in place to sort of manage hallucinations. Yet almost all the practitioners I know use just one LLM. So even the techniques of using LLMs and the technology itself, we need to up our game in terms of the maturity of how we're approaching that. And the second vector, I think, is important to point out. I happen to sit in, I'm not an actuary, but I sit in a large actuarial practice in Oliver Wyman. And I'm old enough to be aware of the days when reserves for an insurance company were not signed off by actuaries. And then the actuaries went to the regulators and said, hey, you need a trusted body of practitioners that can provide reasoning to the governance we have in place. And I was just talking with a whole lot of risk managers the other week, and we were talking about risk management and AI. And we collectively identified that there is not a profession yet that is thinking about risk and governance with AI. So it's less of a human in the loop, but is there a professional organization? Is there a cast like actuaries, could be actuaries, that think about governance and think about how that relates to our ecosystem, the human experience, and technology? Because I think just coming up with a technology solution in and of itself is an insufficient answer to an evolving landscape.
Steve, I remember when we talked last that you talked about the inadequate architecture, right, that sits in many corporations as well. And we as humans, we are asked to validate output at scale today, but no human can realistically manage. Can you tell us a little bit more about your point of view of what is happening right now around what we are being asked to do when a company is moving to become much more AI-powered enterprise?
I can, and I'll use another analogy. I am old enough to remember the days when data centers were not locked down. And developers could go in and touch a server and change things. And this idea of infrastructure, of something that a small number of practitioners can manage to make invisible for everybody else, things like security and cyber, and we don't need everyone in an enterprise to be an expert in cyber management, in server management, in lockdown infrastructure, because we have professions, we have people, we have technology that manages all of that that's highly specialized. We're in a unique moment of time where we still have people grabbing onto the AI and the LLMs with no rules, or limited rules, limited controls, limited expertise, and we're asking too much of practitioners using these tools. And there's a necessary pivot that is beginning to happen where at least now there's a recognition that there's a gap and there's an expertise gap. And my opinion is federating that out to millions of people is probably not a good idea. But thinking about it in an industry and thinking about it across industries is a really good idea. But I'm interested in, is that crazy or what do you think?
It's not crazy. And I'm glad you mentioned rules and made myself a little note so we could talk about that. I think federating out to an enterprise these capabilities, I think we need to take a step back. And from an organizational perspective, what is our AI narrative as a company, as an enterprise? What are the guardrails that our people have in place within the employee handbooks, our company policies and procedures that say, this is how we're going to use AI or not, right? And, the point you made earlier about governance, is our group thinking about this? I don't think that there is. We see a few examples of insurers really taking this seriously in terms of governance as a competitive advantage, standing up AI ethics committees. Some of the work that I'll speak to a little bit later with our own data ethics practice, we're seeing these examples start to pop up, but not near fast enough to keep up with the pace of the technological change. And that is a real gap. So I agree with you, and you're not crazy.
Thank you.
I remember being one of your colleague, Franklin Hoana, where during the presentation, Hoana highlighted, you need to start thinking about your organization based on the data layers, the model layer, and also the governance layer. And at the same time, when you think about governance, right, and maybe a definition of what governance is may be quite relevant now, Franklin, think about it around trust in the identity layer as well. So when, Franklin, things tend to break in big enterprises, and I'm sure you've seen that happen many times when, people think they can do everything with copilots to moving to an autonomous agentic environment. Where do you think they tend to break the most?
So at SAS, we talk about things in terms of people, process, and technology, and like the playbook for adoption and moving your technology to scale. The intentionality of people being first in that equation is the proof point of why that playbook works, because there's still no more sophisticated sensor than a human being and a more powerful computer than the human brain. Your people are your eyes and ears. You have sometimes tens of thousands of them, and they will find out first when something breaks. And typically what breaks is around process. Steve, to make my own age joke, I am old enough to have sat in a room during a lean change agent deployment where we, with little sticky notes would walk out on a whiteboard all of our processes. Well, 25% of what an agent would need to do isn't documented anywhere. It's anecdotal, it's colloquial, it's in now the digital realm of the hallways of our organizations where an underwriter, an adjuster, an actuary asks their colleague, what do I do here? I looked in my manual, I don't know what the next step is. And then they share that tribal knowledge. The process will break first, unfortunately. And with agentic systems, the power of today's artificial intelligence, those processes, when they do break, are going to be incredibly severe. We've seen examples of this in the ecosystem already with basic autonomous systems. And this example I would point out is Cigna's PXDX, a performance to diagnostic model, where 300,000 pre-approved claims were denied in a single month. And that is a process failure In an autonomous example, I can only imagine what's going to happen when you don't address the people, process, and technology in a sufficient way, where now you put an agentic system on top of that for underwriting, claims, sales, customer service, and the downside risk that we're going to see when those systems are deployed without that consideration.
Once they start acting right, not just advising people, this is where trust is really a non-negotiable principle within the organization and part of the operational infrastructure. Anything you want to add, Steve, to this comment from Franklin?
Maybe a slightly orthogonal view. I agree. And there's a narrative that process control and controlling use is scalable. And I don't think either are. I think the mindset now needs to begin to shift to control as infrastructure and trust as infrastructure, something that we aren't relying on a process or a human or saying, I'm just going to lock this down and provide guardrails. The guardrails need to be baked in at every layer. And we will reach a point, or we've already reached a point, where some of the capabilities of agentic AI and AI itself will exceed or far exceed the capabilities of the human in the loop. And the narrative that the human in the loop is the most powerful cognitive agent might not always be true. And I'm going to go on a limb here. I think this idea of AGI, that AI needs to have general intelligence, is also wrong thinking. That AI can develop a type of unique intelligence that's not like human intelligence, that is superior in a way that a calculator is faster than most humans can do math. And if we just extend that analogy, AI is going to have capabilities that are scaled faster, done better than the human in the loop. And that's already happened. It just hasn't happened in the way that we're measuring. Because our yardstick is an AI behaving like a human. Maybe an AI will never behave like a human. That doesn't mean that the risk doesn't exist.
Steve, I also agree that AGI is a myth, that we will not achieve a machine thinking like a human. We don't even understand how the human brain totally works, frankly. And if I break this down to an earlier comment you made, Sabine, we're talking about data and models, right? Very sophisticated models. But to borrow a quote from George Box, all models are wrong and some are useful, right? So the idea that I'm going to get artificial general intelligence that is more human than a human could possibly be in its thinking and its creativity and its ability, we're talking about a model which is a proxy for reality, but not reality itself. So I tend to agree with you. Somebody says AGI is going to be here by 2040. I disagree.
What does trust by design mean for you?
There's some immutable characteristics. We need to know what's happening. So auditability, we need transparency. We need a connection with the human ecosystem and judgment. And these things are non-negotiable. The technology and the processes exist to have all of these things today. How do I know that? We have built those things. But I don't know that they're consistently built in technology and tools that are being deployed. I don't know that they're even being consistently considered. It's normally an after the fact. I built a system, I built a thing, now I need to put guardrails in place. Rather than first principles before the first line of code. How is that infrastructure being deployed in the development of technology, in the deployment of technology, in the maintenance of technology, in the use of technology? Those are invariants, I think, in the evolving ecosystem.
Franklin, when you and your team at SAS talks about trustworthy AI and trust by design, what would be built in from the start? If trust is going to survive everything in the real world we are living in today.
Well, Steve kind of stole part of my answer. The principled approach to the use of artificial intelligence, what we call trustworthy AI, is first and foremost where you do need to start. if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for nothing, and organizations need to have principles. So SAS has 6 principles associated with trustworthy AI. I won't read them all off, but the first one is human centricity, and that is by design, right? We need to be thinking about the use of artificial intelligence to augment what our people are capable of doing, and keep that, Steve, as you mentioned several times, human in, on, or around the loop, right? Trust has become kind of the buzzword in terms of AI use. We see it at the events and on the content. And I challenge anyone listening to this podcast or reading the content later, when you hear that, I would love for you to push back and say, what do you mean when you say trust? What are the principles supporting that trust, and how does it show up in your technology? Is it explainable? Is it transparent? Does it allow you to respond to the regulator? And I wouldn't be shocked if those talking points start to break down, because we are seeing in the ecosystem, you just label everything as trust. So there's a difference between how you're approaching that trust conversation with a principled approach versus just giving that as a tagline to get a lead or sell some software. And I think it's an important distinction to make.
Yeah. And I learned that from you when we started looking at this last year, actually, Franklin, when we start to unpack what governance and compliance versus compliance mean, right? We started talking about transparency, explainability, monitoring, accountability, understanding the model are not stable. So lifecycle discipline as to how we integrate all those different components by making that human the center of everything in some ways, but making sure that as we interact with customers, they know what is happening, because there's still biases. And with those biases, therefore, we can actually impact our relationship with the customer.
I don't know that scales over time. And again, back to the analogy, there is infrastructure that operates today that very few humans interact with. A packet switch network. I challenge many technologists. Do you know how a packet is architected? I do, because I'm old. And I remember the construction of routers and how all that works, but that's not common knowledge. And today we're at another inflection point where we know how these things are architected and how they use, and they're still controllable. I can see us scaling to a point where we have agentic AI and we have infrastructure that is not knowable, or is knowable by a very small number of people. So in this inflection point where we see that future happening, what are we doing about that? Who's thinking about that? What body of professionals is managing that? Because again, this idea that I like this idea of human-centric. I like the idea even more of human-centric at scale, meaning that human-centric does not always mean that humans are going to be center of the loop, but it does mean that this infrastructure, like it or not, we are building out and will scale, should be managed in some way. And I worry that we're not thinking enough about that. And just this morning, I read about another breach, and every month there's a breach somewhere in these providers and these ecosystems. My hypothesis is the breach is sometimes caused by humans, because humans interacting with technology, sometimes mistakes are being made. I think also AI interacting with technology is now creating mistakes. And the idea that those are one-offs is a fantasy. But the idea that they're more like cyber and they're more like an inevitable feature of our ecosystem is a better way to think about the risk landscape.
Anything you want to add to that, Franklin?
So I do tend to agree, Steve, when you say, are we thinking about this in terms of scalability? Is anyone considering like what this future might look like? I would say probably not. I would offer a just thought exercise. Could you have a team of 13 people handling a $10 billion portfolio that are no longer like claims professionals, underwriting professionals, but insurance professionals handling the insurance ecosystem from quote to claim? And they're acting more like agentic supervisors, individuals who do understand the technology, have the ability to explain to a regulator, to a customer, to the board, this is the status of our claims portfolio, our underwriting portfolio, our sales portfolio, the performance. I think we can get there. I think the key gap there is going to be the people that we have in insurance today, because typically we've developed insurance professionals around a singular discipline: underwriters, claims adjusters, sales professionals. And you don't see individuals in those professions that have a high quality of understanding of what agentic even is, let alone to be able to supervise it. And I think that pivot is going to need to happen before we can get to that. Do I think we can get there? Sure. We are seeing individuals come into the labor market today who are digital natives, who understand these concepts, right? I think the challenge is going to be to convince them and insurance is a great career, and getting them into it is more the challenge than teaching them how the technology is used. So maybe a little pushback, but I do tend to agree with you that I don't know that we have that mindset of, to borrow a phrase that you used, Sabine, how do we get to this mecca of becoming a frontier firm, agentic native, and really thinking about this in terms of that scalability?
And let me extend your thought experiment. I am in active conversations with clients on the West Coast of the US that are contemplating in insurance and banking, two very regulated industries, spinning up companies with 0 people in them, run completely by AI. So those conversations are happening now. Are they going to be effective in the first try? Probably not. But are they going to be effective eventually? I don't know, maybe. And I don't know that that's part of the dialogue now.
I think it is, and you start probably hearing. So 2 things you actually touch upon I would like to highlight. The team composition. We've seen research right now talking about M shape, generalist, T shape, we needed, people with expertise and depth as well. The specialist as well is coming as part of this conversation right now. Now, I'm sure you remember McKinsey article where they had 40,000 employees and 25,000 agents. But actually, when you read that data, it's 1 person to 0.6 agents. And when we start looking at where the world is going to go, when we start looking at that balance between that intelligence on top and human and system collaborating with one another and us becoming agent bosses, where we start going to see transformation based on some of the research around the human agent ratio that I'm doing right now, we may actually end up with 1 to 10 to 1 to 100. When we look at complex claims, it might be 1 to 3. So we don't really know yet what is going to look like. But there is definitely a big transformation coming, and everybody is looking at, can we build that 1 billion company with only 1 individual and many agents, which, can be worrying when we start thinking about trust. One thing that comes to mind, though, Steve, is a point you made to me a while ago around accuracy and fidelity of judgment. What should leaders be measuring if they want, to really actually do trust and have businesses which, interact with customer and customers feel comfortable to interact with those businesses?
We now have the ability to do multi-directional trust vector management. And what do I mean by that? We assume the humans have good judgment. That's not a good assumption. Humans have massive bias. And now we worry that AI is going to have bad bias. But is it a more interesting question to say, I have an LLM node, I have another bit of technology, I have some governance rules, I have a log, I have humans all connected and checking each other's work. And not just bias, but this idea of increasing the fidelity of the judgment itself, back testing it, forward testing it, managing it in a more rigorous way. I see this as a plane for us to explore, a laminate for us to say, should we even be trusting ourselves? And I'm going to comment on something you said about 1 in 10 or 1 in 100. I've spent most of my career running large-scale transformations, traditional transformations. And what strikes me is, just speaking the truth, a very small number of people on very large teams do the vast majority of work. And all technology and all people are not equal. And our old ways of thinking about things is we would just create make work for the people that weren't as productive. And then we would protect the small number of people that were highly productive. But now that we're scaling, and I'm just introducing another concept here, what are we going to do with the human experience if the ratio isn't 1 to 10 or 1 to 100? What if it's 1 to 1,000,000? And we have a very, very small number of hyper efficient, hyper focused, high-fidelity experts, then what does that mean for the human experience? And what does that mean for managing the non-efficient people? And what do they do? And what risk and benefit does that pose, not just for the exam question, but just for our overall ecosystem?
Gosh, 1 in a million. I don't know how to think about it. Maybe you want to respond to this, Franklin, but I would make a comment based on the conversation I just had last week, which is we are back to the first industrial revolution and the second industrial revolution, which means when we actually implemented the steam power engine, it took the businesses 60 years to adjust, right? Infrastructure operationally. When we actually moved to intelligence on tap with electricity during the second industrial revolution, that took us 30 years. Now, today, we are in the AI revolution. And some experts think we are going to get there in 10 years. So anything you want to respond to that, Franklin, looking at, the 1 to a million, which my brain cannot compute just now, but, who knows?
Steve, I do agree with you. You've got some of your top performers in those teams that are shouldering the majority of the work, right? That I believe is fairly ubiquitous as far as the truth for not just insurance companies, but I think all companies in terms of that imbalance. At every point in human history, when there has been technological innovation, people have moved upstream. That goes back to, the sabots that were thrown in textile looms because people thought that the loom was going to take their job. And that's how we get the word saboteur. Sabine, you mentioned steam power, electricity, et cetera. And with this most recent, November 30th, 2022, we saw the creation of prompt engineers as a career to help manage some of the outputs for LLMs. It is not going to be a one-to-one transformation, in my opinion. There's not going to be one job created for everyone eliminated. But we can start playing around with certain things that I believe makes the quality and lifestyle of people's careers better. Can I now lean into a 4-day work week, right? Because I have capacity. Can I start approaching that economic singularity and universal basic income and some of these other concepts where, frankly, people are working more hours than we have in a given work week? They're working evenings, they're working weekends, they're answering 150 emails a day. They're in meetings for 5 to 6 hours. There's an imbalance we need to correct before we can get to that 1 to a million to just kind of level set. Because post-COVID, it's been nuts, right? Like, especially with work from home trends. So I think that there's some truth in the middle in terms of how we get there. Sabine, I do think we get there faster than the 10 years, frankly. But we will also see pivots to other areas. Last thing I'll mention on this point, NVIDIA just released a blog that AI is a 5-layer cake, and the base of that layer is energy. We are seeing a ton of job creation in the energy infrastructure space because, quite candidly, AI needs power to run. We need electrical engineers. We need people who know construction, who can build data centers. We need forms of energy like solar, wind, nuclear. The human race is going to pivot to some of these other areas where 1 to a million might not be a problem because capacity is created elsewhere.
So I would like to dive into the leadership test now. What CEOs and boards must do today to actually jump on the bandwagon? Starting with you, Steve. Let's think about that CEO, right? And its board, right? If they want to implement trust and that becoming part of their infrastructure rather than just the presentation slide, what is the first hard decision they need to make for you?
Moving away from the hype and beginning to index harder on the under the water things. In my parent company, we have a lot of different AI organizations, and some of them are really focused on transformation that matter moments, but they're efficiency plays. And I love efficiency plays. Those are fantastic. And as a consultant, that brings joy to my heart to make things better and more efficient. It's the index to say the trust agenda is even more important than the efficiency agenda. And the trust agenda for the environment, for your company, for the fidelity of your answers. This idea that maybe your actuaries are the most important people in your company. That is a hard shift psychologically, because historically the control vectors The accountants, the actuaries, are viewed as back office practitioners. They're viewed as an afterthought, as something that, well, I have to do them. Right now, during this 2-year or 10-year shift, one of those answers is right or somewhere in between, it is imperative for the boards and C-level executives to pay attention and index hard on those under the water people and capabilities that are the tip of the spear that are going to take us through the turbulence of this transition from where we are now to where we're going to be.
You know, a lot of research highlight that the chief finance officer today is probably one of the most important executive on the board because of the risk that needs to be managed, the guardrails that needs to be put in place, and anything which is done by AI, if we want to actually ensure that there is execution, there's a financial impact. Frankly, if you were advising a CEO and the board around one of the 3 non-negotiable, you would insist for them to consider if they were going to implement agentic workflows, transform their companies to become frontier, what would that be?
Yeah. So the foundation here is going to be incredibly critical. You can't do agentic if you don't have the right chassis to do agentic, right? And oddly enough, my 3 recommendations are less technology oriented and more people centric. Embrace new color, break down your data silos, and protect the brand no matter what. So what do I mean by that? We're starting to feel out this idea of new collar, not white collar or blue collar, but new collar, the worker that is using AI as a part of their day-to-day, this digital infrastructure, AI literacy or AI narrative, the codification of AI safe use gives you that clear accountability because, again, as I mentioned earlier, the human being is still the most sophisticated sensor on the planet. So you need those individuals really honed in on AI's use, its safe use, et cetera. Breaking down the data silos. I've been in too many organizations and conversations where the data does not connect. And that is a strategic advantage. You need to remove those barriers in order to fuel that AI so you can make good decisions. Agentic is not going to work if you don't have access to the data that it would need to make those decisions. And unfortunately, that's going to mean that you're going to have to collaborate across ecosystems. Your chief claims officer is going to have to talk to your chief underwriter, to your chief actuary, to your chief risk officer. We have these disparate data silos that can inform each other, inform outcomes. And protect the brand is kind of, it's governance, but not labeled as governance because governance is not sexy. We're in a highly commoditized industry. And it takes decades sometimes to build trust in your insurance company and seconds to erode it when something bad happens. So an agent making a decision on a claim or underwriting a policy, it's going to require governance, compliance, and monitoring at the highest level of the organization to protect the brand. It's not to respond to the regulator, which is a benefit, but it's the idea that your brand is synonymous with trust because no matter what interaction happens across the insurance value chain, a customer understands that whether it's a person or a technology that's making a decision, I can trust the outcome. And that means inventorying your AI, documenting those controls, saying no to shadow IT, and having line of sight to all of that. And frankly, we're thinking about that wrong today in terms of I'm going to invest like 1% of my IT budget in compliance because that's all it means to me. That is backwards. You need to be thinking about protecting the integrity of the brand no matter what.
I think if you were listening to this and you are a regulator or you're a risk manager, you're the most important person in the world today. Your job is not ancillary. Your job is world changing.
Mm-hmm.
So tackling this problem head on and saying, okay, this is something we're going to address today, not with a vague rule or fear, but with courage and bravery and say, there's something broken and we intend on fixing it. That is what is going to get us through. Federating this out to 1,000 companies, that's unlikely to give us a coherent answer. A small number of regulators banding together and deciding this is a problem that we have the ability to fix at scale will get us through.
Yeah. So let's go back to the definition. Frontier insurance, so frontier firm, intelligence untapped, human agent collaborating, and us as human becoming agent bosses or managers. But to achieve that, we need to build ecosystem partnership. We need to integrate AI in the right way. We need to have the right leadership, the right change management, the right agility and flexibility. But the first ingredient remains governance and ethics. And it is not a technology transformation. It's actually a cultural and people transformation. So asking my last question to you both, starting with you, Franklin. What will separate the firms which are going to be frontier from the one we just talked about it?
Yeah, so I'm going to make a prediction here. By 2040, every company will be an AI company. And we need to make peace with that idea that it's not some fad. It is a technology that, to borrow a quote from Jensen Huang, is becoming the foundation of our entire society. Very similar to 25 years ago, nobody Googled anything. And now it's a verb and it's ubiquitous in all of our processes. I think we need to separate this idea in terms of frontier firms. The ones that will be successful are already working with that future in mind and figuring out how to get there versus denying that that outcome is going to be possible. The only umbrage I will take with my own prediction is it will likely happen faster than 2040.
Yeah. What about you, Steve?
I agree it's going to happen faster than 2040. Today, if you are a large company and you're operating as an executive on the control plane, if you're a C-level executive, if you can make decisions that shape the destiny of these companies, my prediction is the companies that win are going to call up their regulators. They're not going to try to manage their regulators. They're not going to try to avoid the regulation. They're going to embrace the regulation because this understanding that controlling this at scale across industry as infrastructure is an existential reality. That is the responsibility of the leaders that we have in our ecosystem today. And the regulators need to be ready for that conversation.
Well, I hear from you both that the future will not belong to the firms which actually implement a lot of AI, Gen AI, agentic workflows, right? It will belong to those who build with trust and think about their infrastructure, the core of their transformation to drive the right decision. This will be the real frontier organization. So thank you to you both for joining me today. Thank you, Franklin. Thank you, Steve. Let's be clear. This isn't a technology conversation anymore. It is a leadership test because once AI systems start acting, meaning approving, declining, recommending, executing, every decision they make becomes a reflection of your governance, your culture, and your accountability. And here is the uncomfortable part. If you cannot explain how a decision was made, if you cannot trace it, test it, or challenge it, then you are not scaling intelligently. You are scaling risk. What Steve and Franklin have made clear today is that trust by design is not optional architecture. It is the difference between organizations that can safely scale autonomy and those that will eventually be forced to pull it back. So, for every CEO and every board listening, the question is no longer, do we trust AI? The real question is, have we built a system that deserves that trust? Because the frontier firm won't be defined by how fast they adopt AI, but by how deliberate they design trust into every decision that AI makes. And that is not a technical choice, that is a leadership one. If today's conversation challenged how you think about AI trust and decision-making, good. Because that is exactly where transformation begins. We are moving into a world where intelligence is on tap, where humans don't just use systems, they orchestrate them, and where every leader becomes, in effect, an agent boss. So this isn't just about technology. It is about how you redesign your organization to operate with confidence at scale. If this episode sparked new ideas or perhaps a few uncomfortable questions, don't let them sit idle. Share it with a colleague. Bring it into your next leadership discussion. And most importantly, ask yourself, What would it take to build a frontier firm in my organization? One where trust is not assumed, but engineered. This year, I'm going deeper into exactly that, what it takes operationally to move from experimentation to execution to leadership. If you enjoy this conversation, subscribe and drop me a note on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear what you want me to explore next. And yes, if you believe more leaders need to hear this, leave me a 5-star rating. It matters more than you think. I am Sabine VanderLinden, and this is Scouting for Growth, where we don't just talk about the future, we design for it together. Until next, stay curious, stay bold, and keep building what others may still only talk about.